Today I'm going to be presenting a study that we've done on sketching and repeated interviews to elicit information and veracity cues. So we know from previous, just a moment. We know from previous research that sketching while narrating facilitates retrieval more than a free recall. And it also facilitates veracity cues more than a free recall. That's mostly because sketching helps with strengthening truth-teller's memory or eyewitness memory. And it has limited effects on truth-tellers. So truth-tellers, light-tellers try to keep their accounts simple. They avoid giving leads to investigators, so they do not want to be very detailed in their sketches. Whereas truth-tellers, they are cooperative, and the sketches help them with reinstating the context. So that should help them with recalling more information, and that would make them elicit more veracity cues than light-tellers who would say less. So these veracity differences are usually more profound when sketching while narrating than when providing a free recall. So the focus of this study was on sketching while narrating. So that's when people sketch and talk at the same time, because this has yielded better results than sketching alone in a study where all sketching like types were compared to each other. This study was not published yet, but we found that in our lab. Sketching while narrating repeated interviews was not examined before. It was only examined in one study, to my knowledge, at least. And that was in our lab. So participants in that study reported about a memorable event that they've experienced. And they were asked to either tell the truth about it or to claim that they have experienced it. So they were light-tellers. They were interviewed 3 times. Each interview was 1 week apart. And then in the first and second interviews, they either provided a sketch while narrating, or they provided a free recall, or they provided a sketch while narrating in the 2 interviews. In the third interview, everybody provided a free recall. Sorry. Oh gosh, sorry. Okay. So what we found was that truth-tellers provided more details than light-tellers, and sketching while narrating elicited more details than the free recall. So this was in line with our predictions, but for the interaction effect, we did not find any significant results. And we wondered whether accessing the sketch in the interview after the sketch is provided, would that have elicited more veracity cues? And thus, we attempted to test this in the current study. Now, there's obviously no research on accessing sketches, so we relied on note-taking and accessing note-taking literature to develop our theory or theoretical discussion. And we relied mostly on the jurors' note-taking literature. And that research, usually the mock jurors, they would watch a trial via a video medium, and then they would either take notes or not taking notes while watching the video. And at a later stage, they would be asked to recall the information they recall from the trial. Usually in that research, it was found that note-taking enhances recall compared to not taking notes, and accessing the notes at recall also enhances recall. So obviously accessing the notes served as a way to facilitate memory and thus enhance recall. We expect the same to happen when accessing sketches and repeated interviews, but this would only apply for truth-tellers, but not for light-tellers. And the reason for this is that for truth-tellers, that would be a retrieval cue if they access the sketches, but for light-tellers, they would want to stick to their counter-interrogation strategies of keeping the recount simple and of repeating themselves, because light alerts usually stick to the strategy of maintaining consistency, because they know that investigators, they usually associate consistency with honesty. So they try to repeat themselves and avoid the provision of new information. However, there's research showing that if you change the modalities between interviews, then light alerts' performance on consistency will drop. So if they are asked to sketch and narrate in the first interview and then to provide a free recall in the second interview, then they will no longer be able to be consistent and repeat details. So we'd expect them to not repeat details in those cases. So overall, the purpose of the research that we've conducted was to examine the effects of sketching while narrating compared to a free recall on repeated interviews, and to examine accessing sketches compared to not accessing sketches in repeated interview, and how that would enhance or not the elicitation of information and veracity cues. So I'll go quickly over the veracity cues that we've conducted, that we've examined. We've firstly examined Plato details. That's an acronym for person, location, action, temporal, and object details. So we were interested in the richness of the account. I give an example here of how we code Plato details. So Natalie ran towards the building as soon as she saw the man holding a gun. Natalie and man would be person details, and ran, saw, and holding would be considered action details. Towards the building are two location details, as soon as is a temporal detail, and gun is an object detail. And we also examined complications, which are a combination of details that make a story more complicated. An example is the lift door did not open. We also examined verifiable sources, which are checkable information that can be verified by the investigator or that can be traced by them. So this includes credit cards, receipts, and telephone calls. These are usually truthfulness cues because they occur more among truth-teller statements than in light-teller statements. That includes sketching while narrating interviews. We also examined the fourth cue, which is a deception cue, because we'd expect it to occur more among light-tellers than truth-tellers, and that's scriptedness. This has not been examined before, so this is a new cue to be added to the list of cues. And we defined this as are the activities described in a way as activities typically happen, so as people usually think they happen. This is a rated variable, so it would be rated on 7-point Likert scale. And we thought it would occur more among light-tellers because in previous research, light-tellers tend to report more common knowledge details than truth-tellers. They also rehearse more and prepare more for the interviews, so their accounts should appear also more scripted than those of truth-tellers. So our hypothesis, we've done hypothesis for interviews 1 and 2. In the first interview, participants either provided a free recall or they sketched and narrated. And in the second interview, everybody provided a free recall, but those who sketched were either given or not access to their sketches. For the first set of hypotheses, this applied to the 2 interviews. We firstly expected a veracity main effect, where truth-tellers would report more Plato details, complications, and verifiable sources than light-tellers, and their account would also appear less scripted than light-tellers. So for interview 2, we marked repeated and new details as well. We expected also a modality main effect, where participants who are asked to sketch and narrate will report more Plato details, complications, and verifiable sources, and their accounts will be less scripted than those who provide a free recall. Lastly, we predicted an interaction effect in the 2 interviews, where the veracity effects would be more pronounced in the sketch condition than in the free recall condition. In interview 2, where we manipulated the access variable, where participants who sketched had or did not have access to the sketch, we predicted the main effect, where those who have access to the sketch would report more repeated and new play-to-details complications and verifiable sources, and their accounts will be less scripted than those who do not have access to the sketch. Also, we expected the veracity differences to occur more in the access condition than in the no access condition. Okay, so this was for the hypothesis. For the methodology, we recruited 173 participants and asked them to do some activities next to the department. So we did this as a mock mission, and then they returned back to the department where they were interviewed immediately. They returned back after 1 week for the second interview. And at the end of the study, they were asked to complete a questionnaire where they completed their demographics, the strategies they've used during the interview to appear convincing, and their motivation levels and other experiences, and then they were rewarded. Later on, we transcribed and coded the interviews for the veracity cues. So in interview 1, participants were randomly allocated to the veracity conditions, and half of those were either asked to sketch and narrate what they've done in the mock mission, or they were asked to provide a free recall. In the second interview, after 1 week, everybody provided a free recall, and those who sketched and narrated in the first interview were provided the free recall either with or without the sketch in front of them. So these are some charts from the results. The veracity main effects were supported for the 2 interviews for all dependent variables. So truth tellers provided more play-to-details, complications, and verifiable sources than lie tellers. And for scriptedness, these were lower for truth tellers than lie tellers, so in line with our predictions. The modality main effect was only supported in interview 1 and only for location and temporal details. So sketches elicited more location and temporal details than the free recall. We also found an access main effect in interview 2, but only for repeated action and temporal details, and in line with the prediction where the action and temporal details occurred more in the access condition than in the no access condition. We did not find any interaction effects. So to discuss the veracity effects, these were in line with our predictions and with previous research, and also with the self-reported strategies of truth tellers who reported they were more forthcoming in the interview, whereas lie tellers reported they kept their accounts simple. So this aligns nicely with what we know about veracity conditions. It was also nice to see that scriptedness worked as a deception cue and that it elicited large effect sizes. So this also aligns with previous research on common knowledge details. And because there's recent call by deception researchers to look more for deception cues, because the majority of cues in the deception research are truthfulness cues. So this scriptedness cue could be added to the deception cue. It also has practical implications where instead of using only truthfulness cues to decide whether someone is lying or not, we can use a combination of truthfulness and deception cues. So this especially applies in forensic interviews. For the modality effects, we found only partial support for our hypothesis, where sketching elicited more location and temporal details than a free recall, and only in interview 1. We wanted to delve deeper and understand why only location and temporal details were elicited. And we looked at the open self-reported strategies that participants used. We saw 2 strategies that might be relevant, and these were using a mental map, or using a chronological account as a strategy. Now, when someone uses a mental map, they are likely to think of a timeline and of where each activity happened, so location and temporal details. And those were like the mental map and the chronological accounts were reported by 50 participants, and 37 out of those 50 were in the sketching while narrating condition. So we'd expect the sketches to elicit more of the location and temporal details because of the strategies that sketches make participants or suspects use. So this has practical implications because in real life interviews, the suspects would be reporting more complicated and longer events. So this would help them with the list more location and temporal details if sketching while narrating is used. It was quite interesting to find the lack of modality effect in interview too. And the reason for that is that it replicates a previous finding of ours, where sketching did not carry over, like the effects of sketching were only evident in the interview in which sketching was requested, and there were no carryover effects to the subsequent interviews. So there's more research that needs to be done on this to corroborate this conclusion, but yeah, it's quite interesting that they replicated. Now we found access effects, but only for 2 variables. So that was for repeated action and temporal details. Apparently accessing the sketch did not help with recalling information from the mock mission, but only information that's reported in the sketch. And we also did not find any interaction effects. So we thought that maybe a more structured sketch with subheadings where people would draw under like a subheading where person details is mentioned. They would like draw each detail separately in a more structured manner, for example. This might have enhanced the elicitation of new details and of veracity cues. And we built this on previous note-taking literature, which showed that structured notes work better than freestyle notes for enhancing recall. So yeah, perhaps that would strengthen Trusteller's memory in the first interview, and accessing the notes, the sketches in the second interview would help them with recalling new information. So in conclusion, sketching while narrating seems to be more effective than free recall for eliciting information, but only in the interview in which it is requested. And accessing sketches is in a repeated interview is limited. So the benefits of accessing sketches is limited when the focus of the interview is on eliciting new information and veracity cues, but it's helpful for confirming previously reported information. Okay, thank you.